Thank you very much, Winnie. The DVC academics, my fellow colleagues, professors, lecturers, and students who are here today. Let me begin by saying that I'm very happy to be here today at this very important occasion of marking the 50th anniversary of the Institute of Development Studies, for which we are all very fond. I see people like my friend Judy there, with whom we have gone through many paths in this university. But my task here now really is to introduce my friend, Dr. Adebayo, or Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, whom I've known for a very long time. Adebayo is a man that in the African social science scene is extremely well known. After his undergraduate courses, he attended Leeds University for his PhD, from where he proceeded to the Institute of International Affairs in Lagos, a very well-known institute in Lagos for research and studies of international affairs. He didn't stay that long there. Adebayo has always been on the move for good reasons. He went to the Norwegian African Institute in Uppsala, where he spent some time as a scholar. And I remember the first time that I read articles from Bio was when he was with the Nordic African Institute in Uppsala. His stay in Uppsala exposed him to a lot of development institutions and scholars in the development world. And it's not a wonder that when the late Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, after retiring from being president of Tanzania, he set up the South Center in Geneva. And it was that center that Mwalimu Julius Nyerere invited Bio, as we call him, to go and provide a strong social science and research content to what the South Center was doing. Before then, we African scholars had, in the early 70s, I say about 1974-75, started on the ribs of the Institute for Economic Planning and Development in Dakar. I call it on the ribs because I was there in Dakar in 75 when Abdallah Bujra, Professor Abdallah Bujra, who is one of us, started the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA. And it was literally on the ribs of IDEP. Because IDEP was a big UN organization. Professor Samir Amin was grateful enough to give us offices on the side of IDEP. We always went on the side and entered the rooms, and there is where Bujra established CODESRIA. Several years later, CODESRIA was then headed by Tandika Mkandawire. And on Tandika's retirement from CODESRIA, we got Bio to come and head CODESRIA. He headed CODESRIA with distinction. And I think it's during his time that many of you might have gotten support from CODESRIA, the small grants and so on, which he continued from Tandika. And of course, he did, I think, a good tour in CODESRIA before he moved over now to IDEP, where CODESRIA had been born. And again, they served 2 good terms at IDEP. The only thing Bio didn't do is that he had promised me that I would go and give a lecture in IDEP, but he never did it. And now Bio is here in Addis Ababa with an international idea covering Africa and I think the Middle East region for the international idea. For those of you who do not know, the international idea is a very important international institution which deals with democratization and democracy. And Bio has written extensively on democratization, democracy, a subject we share, and I'm quite sure in going to talk about development research and development studies from now and on, a critical review, he will obviously, I'm sure, talk about whether democracy is still on the agenda or is taking a back burner. But not to predict what Bio is going to say. Let me also thank my former student, Winnie Mutula. Now some will talk about Willie now. Now Winnie was in the first class that I taught at this university. And one of the brightest and most brilliant students I had. no doubt that is now a professor and head of the IDS and doing better than I ever did. So could I take this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to humbly invite my colleague and my friend, Adebayo Olukoshi.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Peter Nyong'o, for your kind words of introduction, and thank you also, Deputy Vice Chancellor, for the welcome. I would also like to thank colleague and friend Winnie Mitula for the kind invitation to be part of this celebration. It was almost going to be a touch and go to make it to Nairobi, but occasions like this are not frequent, and given the central importance of the IDS to the entire African intellectual and policy landscape, I certainly was convinced that no sacrifice would be too small to come to join you in celebrating today. So thank you very much for the invitation. And I whispered to Professor Peter Nyong'o that now that I'm in Addis Ababa, that invitation to Dakar, which didn't happen when I was at IDEP, is going to happen in the political capital of Africa. It was in fact an invitation which we discussed in a context which is not dissimilar to what we are discussing in the context of the theme of this 50th anniversary. Professor Peter Nyong'o, as a scholar, politician, statesman, had been an important part of the IDEP story, the Institute, the United Nations Institute for Economic Development and Planning, and had in fact headed a committee which had been set up by the ECA, the Economic Commission for Africa, to revisit the entire IDEP experience and make recommendations, which it was my fortune to come to implement. I was appointed, and one of the first documents handed over to me was the report which had been written by a team led by Professor Peter Nyong'o. And he was also Minister of Planning in Kenya, so although by the time I came on board at IDEP, he had moved on to another portfolio, I nevertheless thought that IDEP owed him a huge debt of gratitude for the cogent recommendations which his committee made and which played an important part in helping to revive the Institute in the service of the continent. The conversations of the 1990s centered really around questions of how we were going to revive development thinking on our continent. And I found it to be a very happy coincidence that the theme of this anniversary is rethinking development. Rethinking development and development studies as a field. And if we were to take the difficulties which development studies as a field experienced in the 1990s, we may well be advised to go back in time in history to the origins of development studies as a field of endeavor and some of the struggles that were waged to try to establish it in the form of institutes around the world, not least here in Nairobi, but also as a domain of respectable intellectual engagement. Because in truth, much of our experience around the world, and not just in Africa, in Asia and in Latin America, shaped within the context of colonialism, was one in which the idea of development did not really come into policy and intellectual conversations until the period around the Second World War. In the period leading up to the Second World War, the essential preoccupation of colonialism, to put it crudely, was simply the exploitation of the colonies. to the maximum extent possible and as efficiently as possible in order to develop the metropolitan centers. And much of this preoccupation was captured in the 1970s in the dependency debates which dominated the social sciences, debates which originated in Latin America when scholars like Andre Gondafranc and his colleagues attempted to understand why Latin America, after centuries of external domination, effectively remained underdeveloped, and simultaneously those that dominated the region appeared to develop in leaps and bounds, and came to the conclusion that development and underdevelopment were opposite sides of the same coin. In order to develop themselves, the metropolitan colonial powers, the dominant imperialist powers, effectively needed to keep the colonies underdeveloped. And some might argue that this is a fairly crude way of stating the situation. And debates did proliferate even amongst the dependency scholars on how to best capture the nature and the dynamic of the relationship between the colony and the metropolitan center. But I think we can leave that debate aside for the time being and simply focus on the fact that the idea and concept of development did not come of age and to stand on its own until the period around the 1940s, around the Second World War, when many things which had been taken for granted in the social sciences, particularly in the field of economics, were brought into question, not just in Europe, which was recovering from war, but also in other parts of the world, where the movement for self-determination and national liberation began to gather momentum, and to question the paradigm of the civilization mission, the civilizing mission that became the framing ideology to justify colonialism. With colonialism essentially underpinned by a dynamic and logic of exploitation, the notion of a civilizing mission was the weird thing. Nationalist politicians across Africa, Asia, and other parts of the global south were to challenge colonialism even on the basis of its own self-declared principles, and in assessing it as a complete failure, began to push the case quite successfully for self-determination and independence that was achieved in India and which was to spread to other parts of the developing world, especially Africa. That context also was one in which a Europe which was recovering from war, having been devastated by the Second World War, needed to ask itself very hard questions about economic management. Up to the period of the 1940s, much of economics was centered around neoliberal ideas of free trade in order to promote growth. And a certain growth fetishism had dominated the thinking of those who had responsibility for framing the context for the management of national economies. The free trade neoclassical framework was initially very badly shaken by the depression that occurred in the interwar years, the 1929 Great Depression. By the 1940s, with revolution spreading across Europe, the Soviets had taken over half of Europe. China was on the revolutionary path. Much of the rest of Europe was under severe pressure in order to avoid revolution, to rethink the basis for economic management and governance. And within this framework, the makings of the first welfare state systems emerged. And two big intellectual debates dominated the discussion about the recovery of Europe from war. So whilst on the one hand, we had a movement that was beginning to challenge colonialism and the ideology of civilizing the peoples of the colonized world as nothing other than a hollow justification for the exploitation of one region of the world. On the other side of the world, which was the metropolitan center, the dominant center in the international economic system, the threat of revolution, the collapse of economic infrastructure, pressures from the working people demanding jobs, effectively forced a rethinking of economic management on the agenda of governments. And responses which were made effectively were defined within the context of the debate between what we know as the Marshall Plan idea and the Morgenthau Plan, which is probably less known than the Marshall Plan. The Morgenthau Plan essentially developed as a strategy to primarily contain the capacity of Germany to wage war again and to promote the re-agrarianization, as it were, of Germany in order to prevent it from being an industrial power. And the arguments which came from the likes of Lord Keynes, which eventually won a partial victory over the Morgenthau Plan, and which underpinned some of the ideas that went into the Marshall Plan of the necessity for an interventionist state system that will drive a dynamic of reflation, of reflating the economy in a way that will also simultaneously help to overcome the perennial problem of capitalism, namely its vulnerability to a boom-bust cycle. Moments of growth and expansion in the economy, followed by moments of collapse and depression. Lessons which Lord Keynes drew from the Great Depression and which informed most of his presentations about how Europe might be reconstructed. And it was in the midst of all of this that the idea of development came to the table and how it might be secured by nations and countries. If in an earlier period, the question was how to secure the wealth of nations, with the wealth of nations put under severe threat and the basic premises of neoliberal economics challenged by the experience of the Great Depression, by the 1940s, the key question, given the challenges of the time, was how to secure the development of nations and what kinds of economic principles could be put in place in order to govern the system. The foundations, therefore, for the contemporary international economic system and the framework of development within which it has been governed were laid in that period. At the national level, most governments, influenced by the Keynesian idea of reflating economies in crisis and managing the boom-bust cycle of capitalism, complemented by an attempt for the first time in international economic history to also set up systems of international economic coordination. International economic coordination that will go beyond the extremely limited agenda of the General Agreement of Tariff and Trade, GATT, which we now know as WTO in its contemporary rendition, to incorporate the coordination of exchange rates and the management of the payments of nations' external payments that resulted in the establishment of the International Monetary Fund, which we all know, and also the establishment of an international bank for reconstruction and development, which we know as the World Bank popularly, all came out of a moment in world history in which an attempt was made to put development on the agenda. Just as an aside, I think many will find it highly ironic that the World Bank, especially, which was set up as an institution to be a driver in a proactive way through reflationary policies and through investments in infrastructure, with an idea that the public enemy which countries needed to govern and master was unemployment, was itself in a subsequent period, in a period of maybe less than 40 years, to become the champion of the exact opposite of what it was set up to do in the first instance, when it was captured by the neoliberals and became one of the key champions of the neoliberal ideology that basically challenged the very precepts of development that informed the establishment of the World Bank and the IMF. So basically this was the scenario in the 1940s. And I want to suggest that without going into some of the debates that have taken place on whether it was advisable, whether the international system has been well served by the concept of development as opposed to the notion of progress, which dominated thinking amongst political economists in the period up to the Second World War. The idea of progress of humanity understood in terms of cumulative leaps in human civilization, and which involved thinking beyond the economic realm to include the political, the social, and the cultural, in a holistic understanding of how humanity, moving from its early beginnings, has made important progress from age to age, and what the factors driving such progress are. While we well served to have dropped the concept of progress and to embrace the concept of development, there's a huge debate about that. But nevertheless, once the idea of development took hold, there was really no stopping it for much of the period between the 1940s until the 1980s. And it was in this context that even the colonial administration, influenced by the shifts in policy in the metropolitan center, influenced by pressures from below in the colonies themselves, as the colonial peoples began to demand better services, to demand equality, to demand jobs, to demand freedom, and culminating in independence. Even the colonial administration, the late colonial administration itself, began to introduce the notion of development into its discourses. Studies have been conducted which looked at the speeches of some of the governors general that presided over colonies on the African continent. And from an early discourse which emphasized the necessity for colonies to pay their way, and that not a dime was going to come from the metropolitan center to subsidize the colonies, but colonies must generate resources from within their own means in order to pay for the colonial administration, with all of the taxes which colonial governors were to levy in the colonies. By the 1940s, their discourse became a discourse of development in the colonies. And investments began to be made on a scale which had not been seen before in the colonies, in areas of infrastructure and social services that became the foundation for some of the first development plans that we saw on the African continent. Development plans which were pioneered in the period after the Second World War. So essentially, we come to the concept of development with the idea that this is a universally applicable concept, at least in its origins, a universally applicable concept which has relevance and resonance, not just for the developing countries as we know them today, but also for the so-called developed countries of the world. And it was in this context that some of the early pioneers of development studies were to begin to frame their problematic, to define the core questions and the challenges which humanity needed to respond to. And no one did this, I think, perhaps more eloquently than Dudley Sears, who had been appointed as the first permanent secretary in the colonial administration in the UK to focus essentially on the question of development, and subsequently became the founding director of the Institute of Development Studies. The Institute of Development Studies, not the Institute for Development Studies, the Institute of Development Studies, at which is located at the University of Sussex in the UK. And you can read about the early discussions concerning the establishment of that institute. Richard Jolly has done an extremely good summary of the history of the founding of the IDS and the debates which took place within the colonial office and the foreign office around what to do in order to bring some dynamism into the colonies and contain the restiveness that was growing as the agitation for independence gathered momentum in different parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And de Sears was very clear from the outset, I think to his credit, that the key challenges which confronted humanity was how it would be possible to establish a system of economic and political governance that would enable humankind to release its potentiality in all of its fullness. In the context of this broad challenge, he particularly in his own writings identified 3 or 4 areas of priority attention for development policy in its early years. Questions of poverty, which if you consider that we are still dealing with issues of poverty today, you'll see that it's a concept that has had a very long career in our vocabulary, and we still haven't managed to master it. But yes, de Sears identified poverty as one of the key challenges, question of illiteracy, and the central role of education in transformation. And the need at the time, again, interesting, to challenge systems that produce or reproduce inequality. And part of his preoccupation was to move development thinkers, as distinct from the preoccupation of economics, mainstream economic discipline at the time, away from what he calls the fetishism of growth, into thinking about more broad-based issues that mattered for humanity. Broad-based issues which the fact of growth alone did not respond to. That an economy can grow and yet perpetuate inequality. That an economy can grow and yet tolerate poverty on a massive scale. An economy can grow and yet does not invest in the literacy of its populace. And how to bridge that divide between growth and the desirable benefits that ought to flow from growth to the citizenry in order to ensure that citizens can achieve their full potentiality as human beings became the stuff of development thinking when it began. Now, I suppose many of us will not have anything to disagree with in this regard. After all, much of our preoccupation, no matter what our vocation may be as scholars or as activists, or as people who specialize in particular disciplinary fields, is how to bring about improvement in society. And this was exactly what de Sears tried to push. I think to his credit also, in the early years of his directorship of the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, he launched projects which not only looked at the challenges confronting the aspiration for development in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, but also within Europe itself. Within Europe. People don't talk about this when they talk about de Sears. But one of the first projects which he launched was actually to look at problems of development in Europe. Problems and challenges of development in Europe. And in the midst of that, he and the pioneers of the field of development studies had to fight many battles. They had to fight battles concerned with establishing the credibility of development studies as a field. Battles which were not easily won in a lot of cases. The Chicago School of Economics, Professor Nyong'o will know, the Chicago School of Economics was very clear that there is nothing called development studies. Not any more than there's anything called gender economics. What is that? There's economics and that's it. And they do it at Chicago School of Economics. You know, if you went to the Chicago School of Economics, even before Milton Friedman, to say you are going to do development, you are not likely to get a supervisor. and if you applied for employment that you had a degree in development studies or even development economics, it was not likely that your envelope would be opened for consideration, not even shortlisted, because they were very clear. So development studies had to confront disciplinary purists. Disciplinary purists who effectively had structured the academy on the basis of tightly defined boundaries of knowledge, in which an economist could do only certain kinds of things, a political scientist could do only certain kinds of things, a sociologist could do only certain kinds of things. And yet development studies by definition, given the problematic it emerged to confront, was multidisciplinary. And multidisciplinarity had absolutely no respect in the early days because it was seen as a shortcut to eclecticism. Eclecticism, which I would suggest to you, was later to become, at least as I understand it today, the very problem that development studies must overcome as we try to reinvent it to meet challenges of the 21st century. So yes, battles were fought to define the field. It started as one in which the problem of development, much like the problem of progress, was understood as a universal concern. It eventually was able to gain traction because the questions which it asked, even at that early stage, were questions which resonated with people in different disciplines, but for which the kind of paradigmatic shift, which often occurs in the academy, was not yet fully ready to unfold itself, but eventually was to result in the triumph of the field of development thinking and studies to gain a place and a presence. Initially, in different disciplines, we had people introducing development economics and rebellious universities where there were rebel faculties, allowing those who were interested in growth theory to continue to do growth theory, but living side by side with development economics, offered as a subsidiary subject. In sociology, the sociology of development. In politics, we did politics of development, and so on and so on and so on. Even the field of anthropology, at least in the hands of some of those at the Cambridge School of Anthropology, in particular those who concentrated on ethnographic studies, confronted and faced issues of development. So much so that a Cambridge anthropologist was to publish a very popular book in the 1970s, which had a very interesting title that showed the confidence of development thinkers. Economics on Trial was the title. Economics on Trial, the anthropological case for a prosecution, in which the anthropologists were looking at the assumptions of the mainstream field of economics and confronting it with the lived realities of people on the ground and saying that there was no meeting point. And that what passed for much of economic policy derived from abstract theory of how economies work actually amounted to a crime. I was almost going to say a crime against humanity. But at that time there was no crime against humanity. It was simply defined as a crime, which cost humanity quite a lot. And by, institutes of development studies began to emerge. Many of them established in the developed countries, a lot of them in the former colonial centers. As independence emerged, old colonial offices were transformed into new development thinking and development studies centers. Apart from the IDS in Sussex, the Overseas Development Institute, which is fairly well known, was also set up, basically inheriting many of the former colonial district officers and providing home for them to continue with some form of development studies. On our side of the world also, as independence emerged, we too went into the field of development. After all, independence had been fought on the basis that colonialism had denied us development. However, we defined development, and the establishment of centers of development studies across the African continent became part of the story of the emergence of the African university at independence. I'm stylizing the story quite a bit, but you'll bear with me. Now, it seems to me that from the initial successes of the field of development studies, and not minding, at least for the time being, the disjuncture that was to arise between development studies in the north and development studies in the south, of how we might understand the difference between the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex and the Institute for Development Studies in Nairobi, which I think was not an accidental decision. It was a deliberate choice which was made. That let's leave that disjuncture aside for the time being. Development studies in the West, which in a sense was also dominant and hegemonic, very quickly became studies about the other. It became less of a study about universal questions confronting humanity and more about studying us, the underdeveloped people, and how we might achieve development. I hope you are following me. It's a major shift which occurred. And I want to suggest that that shift constitutes the original sin from which development studies is yet to recover. It is the original sin from which development studies is yet to recover, and many of the difficulties which we have had with it as a field of study originate from this shift. Richard Jolly, in his monograph on the history of the IDS, actually suggests that there was something a bit eerie about the fact that the shift occurred at autonomy is possible, but in Africa there is what he called straddling, and that individuals in the urban milieu straddled also the rural context, in the same way as the rural population had a wealth of transactions with the urban center, as to make it senseless to divide an understanding of Africa between the urban and the rural. Right? Remember the popular literature that was produced in the 70s based on the study of Zambia, coming out of the IDS, and which basically talked about an urban bias in African development policy making. And the response which came from the likes of Kabiru Kinyanjui working out of here was that actually the urban African is also somebody who, at least at that point in time, sociologically, had a wealth of transactions with the rural area. And if you took policy in a direction in which you felt you were particularly favoring the rural, you might in fact also find that there are many urban people who benefit from it, in spite of your best efforts. So yes, development studies in the South attempted to bring some nuance into the field. But I also want to suggest that that intervention was not sufficient to save development studies from the original sin. And effectively, therefore, as the 1970s wore on and the field itself confronted a series of shifts in the international system, we were faced with a situation in which increasingly development studies, dominant development studies, refracted into our context, became the handmaiden of development aid, with the aid community effectively taking over to set the priority agenda for which we development scholars worked. It was no longer a question of us saying that these are the challenges, even not of the world, but of the countries of the South, but development aid practitioners who had the money saying that we think Kenya needs good governance, and all of us will do good governance. We think Kenya needs poverty reduction strategy papers, and we would all produce poverty reduction strategy papers. We think Kenya needs perestroika, And we would also begin to write about perestroika. And the turnover was very frequent. Effectively, it is what I call a situation in which it was no longer development theory and research leading development policy, but rather what policy officials in the aid community thought was their priority, leading development research, in a case in which effectively it was the tail that began to wag the dog, no longer the dog wagging the tail. This was essentially the situation, and it is one which has continued to this day, with serious consequences. It has continued because in the context of the crisis of the 80s and 90s, in the context of the shortage of research money in the universities, the main source for research funding became the aid community, and much of this was later to be concentrated in the World Bank, which, having been taken over by the neoliberals in the so-called Washington Consensus, was able in the early 1990s to declare itself as the most important center for development research and thinking in the world. The World Bank was to hire many development researchers itself, and it was also to pump resources in order to define the agenda for those whom it hadn't hired. Okay? So if you thought you didn't work for the World Bank in a direct way, and you could beat your chest around in the 1990s that you managed to escape going to the World Bank, indirectly, you are also working on an agenda which they defined. And Paul Krugman, another Nobel economist, speaking at a World Bank forum as a keynote speaker, one of the development research conferences of the World Bank, was to suggest that the field itself had become the subject of a counter-revolution from within. If development thinking and research when it came was a revolution, by the end of the 1980s, Paul Krugman suggested in his keynote address at the World Bank Development Research Conference that a counter-revolution had taken place in the field, and the only way in which development research could retrieve itself from the claws of this counter-revolution was what he called a counter-revolution, which would take the field back to the basics. I think we are still waiting for that counter-revolution, and maybe this conference might be the beginning of something. Why not in the ideas itself, where we would begin to try to redefine the parameters of the field and the kinds of questions we need to be answering. But whilst the counter-revolution continued, and in the context of a framing of development studies and research as a study of the other, we suffered a lot of consequences. Our capacity to develop theory became highly constrained, and the field became subjected to theory making that amounted to little more than mimicking. Mimicking in which effectively we borrowed from the disciplines and generalized them as theories applicable to all developing countries and contexts. And so in the 1980s, for example, one of the biggest theoretical constructs which dominated the field of development research centered around what was initially referred to as by Anne Kruger as rent-seeking, and which by the end of the 1980s was generalized into a theory of neo-patrimonialism that provided the question and which also provided the answer, an omnibus theory of behavior, action, and policy outcome that was cause and consequence at the same time, and we didn't even recognize it. That we were posing a paradigm as cause of a problem and consequence of the same problem. Why is Kenya underdeveloped? Neo-patrimonialism. Why can't Kenya reform? Neo-patrimonialism. Why is reform studied? Neo-patrimonialism. It became the universal answer to all the questions which we posed, and effectively denied us our capacity to be original. And I cite this only as one example, because during the same period, in this mimicking of thinking coming out of other disciplines, we found ourselves by the end of the 1990s with nothing less than 24 adjectives by which we described the African state. Nothing. I asked myself at the time I was a bookseller, if I was a student in Professor Nyong'o's class, and on Monday he came to tell me that the Kenyan state is a neo-patrimonial state. On Tuesday he says it's an unsteady state. On Wednesday he says it's actually a collapsed state. On Thursday he says, well, this is a sultanist state. On Friday the concept changes again. I'll be completely lost. And effectively this was what happened in the proliferation of concepts which mimicked ideas from other sources because of the loss of our capacity to be original in identifying problems and building a frame for understanding those problems. We effectively became almost tautological in our description of those issues that we were supposed to provide clarity and explanation for. At the third level, in order to justify, self-justify in the study of the other, we also moved from a development studies which problematized development in the West to one which stylized development in the West into an ideal type. An ideal type against which behavior, action, and outcome in other parts of the world would be measured. And so we built up theories of development and theories of democracy and theories of governance, which assumed that America had no problem. This was how they did it, and this was the combination of things that they put together in order to get where they are today. A stylization which was then commended to us to emulate. And you would only need to look at some of the literature of the period and see the way in which references even to the East Asian model, stylized. This was what they did in a way that wrote out all of the problems, the challenges, the fact that there was experimentation, that in fact development is experimentation, that development cannot be complete without errors, that development as a long-haul experience also suffers reverses. You make progress in certain domains and suffer reverses in other domains. All of those contradictions in the process of development were written out, and the story became a sanitized story of a uniform progress without contestation within it, without the contestation, which in fact, in my view, was necessary for that progress to happen in the first place. So a depoliticized idea of development based on a stylization of the experience of one region of the world transposed to our context in order to then use that stylization as a yardstick against which to measure performance in our part of the world. And this again, in my view, this excessive stylization was to defeat the entire purpose at the origin of development studies and development thinking, and simultaneously to remove the historicization that is necessary for any development scholar to make a useful impact. And so it became impossible. Development studies effectively disconnected itself from other social science discourses. It effectively disconnected itself from discourses which still continue to problematize experiences of transformation in different parts of the world. So if you picked up a development studies book on industrialization in Africa, based on the stylization of the American experience of industrialization, and you picked up an American Journal of Economics, you would read two different stories about the American experience. One stylized for a developing country audience, and the other speaking to a domestic audience in the United States about the real problems of industrialization in the United States. Two parallel discourses which, as I indicated earlier, effectively meant that the capacity of development studies to be multidisciplinary in an effective way began also to be undermined. And in place of a capacity to draw from economics with all of the contestation of ideas that go on in the field, to draw from political science and others, was lost in favor of a stylized reading of what the discipline was supposed to be able to offer for our understanding of the process of development. And so the process of a disconnection between development studies and disciplinary-based research, both in the advanced countries and in our context in the so-called developing countries, became in evidence. And not surprisingly, by the end of the 1980s, some scholars began to ask the question, why do we need development studies actually? What's the point? And a few publications began to come out about the death of development, about the dead end of development studies, because it effectively was no longer responding to questions that needed to be answered, and instead operated from a stratosphere that basically lived in a world of make-believe, a world of stylization, a world of virtual markets in politics, in economy, and in society, of the kind which was perfected by African studies made in the United States, of the African studies that came out of the US, and which particularly pushed this approach to understanding development to the extremes that created a backlash to development research and development thinking. It seems to me, therefore, that if we are to begin to rethink development and rethink development studies as a field, there are many things we need to unlearn, many things we need to unpack and unlearn, beginning with ourselves in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. The idea that development is not a universal problematic, but one that concerns us, I think is increasingly being discarded. Certainly in the context of the crisis of 2007-2008, in the context of what we have seen with Greece, with Spain, with Portugal, with Ireland, context of what we have seen with the United States, it will take a really thick skin not to be forced to step back and ask what is going on here. Because the same problems which we confronted in the 1980s in Africa, which we were told was the result of corruption and neo-patrimonialism, and which spawned 2 decades of theorizing around rent-seeking and neo-patrimonialism, happened in the United States. When it happened in Greece, they say, oh, these are tax dodgers, perpetual tax dodgers, lazy people, easy life. Then it hit Wall Street. And then we began to hear ideas about quantitative easing, too big to fail. It hit the UK, and UK government was nationalizing banks. Wind back to Kenya of the 1980s and the crisis you went through with structural adjustment, in which nationalization and government intervention was not an option, because to do so was to perpetuate neo-patrimonialism. And you needed to free the markets in fundamental ways that would create a new framework. And so double standards and double speak stare us in the face. Today, the IMF Managing Director, Christine Lagarde, tells us that Greece needs to reflate the economy. Greece needs to reflate the economy, not deflate. Keynes, what Keynes said in the 1940s about Europe in crisis. You need to pump money. The debt, the external debt of Greece is unsustainable. Those private lenders who gave money to Greece must be ready to take a haircut. In other words, they must be ready to lose some of their money, because after all, they took a risk. IMF saying this, wind back to the 1980s Africa, and IMF said the world doesn't owe you a living. You must adjust. And development studies repeated that message to African governments We scholars repeated that message, and we became part of what some scholars in the 80s and 90s called a new donor regime of truth. A donor regime of truth that assumed that there was only one way of governing economies and societies in the world, and that governance approach had to be adopted on the pain of conditionality, otherwise you would be excluded. Until the crisis came home to Wall Street and to London, shaking the foundations of the post-war economic system as we knew it, and forcing scholars to begin to rethink, except of course the most die-hard of them in the Chicago School, who continue to argue that the crisis of 2007-2008 in the US and the rest of Europe and in Europe was not because of the failure of markets, but because of insufficient markets. And the government should simply have allowed those institutions that were claimed to be too big to fail. There would have been temporary pain in the system, but the system will self-adjust and recover. You have to be a real fanatic to espouse that kind of thing. But there are fanatics also in many of the disciplines. So this essentially provides us, I think, an important opportunity to ask new questions, to ask questions in the way we are trained as scientists, to say that there is no absolute truth, to go back to the idea of Odysseus from the beginning, in which in his foundational message to the pioneer staff of the ITS in Sussex, he said to them that there is the necessity to relativize development by ensuring that our understanding of the development question is located in context and adequately underpinned by a reading of history. Not an idea of development in which 54 African countries are called upon to do the same thing at exactly the same time. Exactly the same policy at exactly the same time over the last 30 years. We have done structural adjustment together. We have done PRSP together. We did HIPIC initiative together. Then we went into MDGs, and now we are warming up for SDGs. All of us doing the same thing at the same time. Surely the problems of Kenya are not the problems of Somalia. And it may be that there are commonalities across the board. But as development thinkers, our chief challenge is to ask, what is the primary challenge that stands in the way of human progress in Kenya? Lord Keynes defined it in Europe as unemployment. The role of government in securing human civilization in the context of the crisis of the post-war period was to overcome unemployment. And the entire foundation of Keynesian economics was built around the problem of defeating unemployment. The mandate of central banks in Europe became not just price watching, not just inflation targeting, but employment creation. And central banks developed policies which, depending on the economic cycle, would see a reflation or a deflation. And so we are called upon also in the African context to ask ourselves, what is the key challenge that we are confronted with in Africa today? And how do we define a framework and a methodology that will enable us to respond to those challenges in ways that will enable us to be relevant to context, in ways that will enable us to be able to answer the questions which our students put to us. And we cannot justify a context in which we say Africa is rising, and yet the average young African is condemned to unemployment, irrespective of their education. And we cannot talk of a context of an Africa which is rising, and yet we are the same continent where poverty is still on the rise. And on top of it, inequality is expanding in leaps and bounds. And it cannot be acceptable that we are the continent in which key policies about the direction of our economies and society are not taken at home. And that we elect officials like Professor Nyong'o, and when they get into government, their hands are tied because policy is being determined elsewhere. Of what Tandikam Kandawire called choiceless democracies. It doesn't matter. Anybody we elect, their baptism of fire will come when they go to Washington. And they are told this is the policy line that you must follow. What kind of development studies do we carry out in such a context in which we are unable to define priorities at home? And I can go on. Of a continent which keeps $500 billion in reserves, third in the world after China and India, but is unable to invest in basic infrastructure, in which we go to bed in most of Africa without electricity at night. I used to think it was a Nigerian disease. It has become a veritable African disease. Of cities that are sprouting and populating in leaps and bounds, but don't have water. Don't think of Lagos. Don't think of Kibera. Think of Gaborone. We are residents of the city that is the capital of a country described as one of the most successful in Africa. Go for 1 week without water. You don't read it in the headlines. But this is what preoccupies citizens. And if we do not begin to understand development as nothing other than the empowerment of citizens in ways that will make them engaged and active in questions that confront them, then I think those who call for the death of development would be right, and there will probably be no need to rethink anything. Thank you.
I'm sure Adebayo was not going to stop, although he knows that he has to catch a plane at 5. And I'm not going to plane at 5, but go to the airport at 5 for his plane. But let me thank Bayo very much for this fantastic lecture and address, which has really gone through the whole history of development studies and the concept of development and the manner in which there has been discourse over development for a long time, beginning with the crisis before the Second World War, the reconstruction of Europe, and the extension of development in our countries following what was called the imperatives of the collapse of imperialism globally after the Second World War. But as Bayo was talking, I got more and more persuaded that we should teach Marxism in this university. Why? Because I think Marx got it right. Philosophers have described the world in various ways, but the point, however, is to change it. And I think what Bayo was saying, that the whole idea of development is to give an opportunity for human beings to live better than they did yesterday and to overcome those tremendous shortcomings of making it impossible for people to live a livable life. And when he ended the example in Botswana, which has been held as the example of successful development by the city of Gaborone, people are missing water, then indeed we must revisit our whole conception of development and how in practice these theories are transformed into social transformation. Now, Bayo said something very interesting, that so long as the frameworks for policy are developed elsewhere and brought like instant cups of coffee for us in developing countries to drink and therefore get on, it will not work. I'll just tell you a small story. When I was Minister for Planning and National Development in the year 2003, the first 2 weeks I was inundated by ambassadors from all kinds of missions in Nairobi, led by the World Bank, each of whom came to ask me what I was doing with PRSP, Poverty Reduction Strategy Paper. In the end, I told Mukhtar Diouf, who was then the World Bank representative in Nairobi, that really I'm not going to work if every Western embassy comes to ask me about PRSP. Let them come in. This is structural adjustment. Let them come to our conference room and meet them together, and they will tell them what we need to do. When I met them, I told them, look, in a democratic society, when a government is elected, the only document that you need to implement is your manifesto. So this is what you promise people. So give me time for about 6 weeks to transform this manifesto into a development agenda, then we can discuss it later. And if at that point in time PRSP is relevant, then we can embrace it. That is what we did. And when finally it came out with our strategy, which was called Economic Strategy Paper for Wealth and Employment Creation, the NGO world was on me. Why are you talking about wealth? What about poverty? You are now just going to serve the wealthy. So by you see, we need to create wealth to fight poverty. But we have been conditioned that we are in the framework of poverty reduction strategy, not wealth creation for employment. And I think that is what development is about. Can we generate by ourselves enough wealth so that every mouth is fed and every sick person is treated, and he or she who is thirsty gets drinking water, and every person a roof over their head, and freedom to walk and choose and to be secure in our nation. And I guess the issue of security is foremost today, and it's issue of development. In summary, therefore, I think we have had a fantastic day. I will now welcome you to ask questions and make comments. We have 45 good minutes to engage with Bayo before he leaves for Addis Ababa at town at 5 to catch his flight at 9. And of course, going to the airport is another problem of underdevelopment. Could you therefore, anybody just carry out your hands and point at you, and then that young man will carry out the... Bayo will take notes.
Thank you, Professor Olukoshi. My name is Sewa. I'm a Nigerian, but I'm at University of Western Cape, South Africa. I want to ask a very brief question. Since you have finally argued that the neoliberal approach to development has actually failed Africa, can you then actually suggest that is developmental state model in which states are expected to intervene in the economic process that will in long way assist Africa in the process of development?
My name is Rethinking. I'm a student at the Institute of Diplomacy, and I work with the national project. My question is to Bayo, but more so to Professor Nyong'o. I think borrowing the model of wealth creation in Singapore, what can we do? Because from the Singapore model, after creating wealth, there was a mechanism of redistributing that wealth. But from your paper in Kenya, we have the creation of wealth, and we don't have a proper mechanism of redistributing that wealth to effect human civilization or citizen civilization positively. Thank you.
Prof, I was hoping you would comment in a direction you are heading. So I'll put this in the form of a question. The proliferation of centers of African studies and the emergence of the Africanist. Yeah. Are we looking at allies here or at disguised enemies?
enemy said, actually mine is not a question per se, but a comment. From what Professor that was presenting, I don't remember your name, Professor Bayo, for what Professor Bayo was trying to say, there's an indication, and actually my friend over there summarized very well, that liberalism is in some ways not really working the development of Africa as part of the South. But Prof, this thing, even from the desktop research that we did in your class last semester on democracy and the free market, it was our observation that largely democracy thrives best where capitalism is also having a way, because people, when they have some relative wealth, like now what we are seeing in Hong Kong, you'll find that they start making some demands which eventually brings forth the democracy. So this alternative model that is being advocated for, it was being advocated for by Nkrumah and others, and even now people are still talking about it. Do you really think it will work for Africa? Because institutions-wise it has been tried. We just see that autocracy is what comes in. It doesn't work for us, actually. So what is really the way forward? Should Africa adopt a command economy, a Marxist one, the way you're saying we should be taught Marxism, or we should go by the liberal way, but with some limitations?
Well, thank you very much for those observations. I think my compatriot, one of the first things I hope I can leave you with as a message is the importance of avoiding thinking in rigid compartments. You know, it might be good for analysis to compartmentalize, but in reality, is there any economy in the world, any, which we define as successful, which we can say is indeed entirely based on the free market of the type that has been sold to us? Is there any? Because at the end of the day, there is a directing principle. And that principle, in most places, even if it is not admitted or defined in an open way, has a public component to it. For me, that's the most important message. Now, you can ideologically decide to start doing your foreign policy saying that you're promoting free market around the world or promoting democracy. That's your foreign policy. But we shouldn't assume that it is what you are doing at home. Right? It's not what you are doing at home. When governments are busily intervening in a context of democracy, one year you have Republicans come and they cut taxes for the wealthy. Next time the Democrats come, they increase taxes for the wealthy. It's that kind of mixture, which in fact, in reality, means that most economies are governed to an extent by one form of heterodoxy or the other. We have been condemned to assume that there is an orthodoxy, which I call the donor regime of truth. And we must stick to that orthodoxy. But democratic politics, by definition, if it was to be successful, if it works effectively, cannot contain orthodoxy as its defining principle. Because it's at the end of the day also about negotiation amongst interests, which yields a lot of heterodoxy in policy making. And I'll just comment to you the book by Hajun Chang, because it's the most recent expression of what I'm trying to say, in which Hajun Chang, in his book Kicking Away the Ladder, says that the developed countries of today are telling the developing countries of today to do exactly the opposite of what they did in order to develop themselves, and promising them that they will develop by doing the opposite. In the meantime, they themselves are not also doing what they are preaching. That's why I gave the example of too big to fail. When commercial banks established at independence in many of our countries as the most important development banking institution that also banked the rural population, went into trouble. In some cases, they didn't even go into trouble. They were just privatized because of an ideological or doctrinal commitment to a particular line of policy making. There was no way you could convince the World Bank and the IMF that these institutions were too central and so too big to be privatized into the hands of individuals who would dismantle them and empty them of the development purpose for which they were set up. And these are the kinds of things that we also need as scholars to step back and challenge. If it's good for the goose, it must be good for the gander also. Why do you tell us to do things that you don't do yourself? And even make it a conditionality of our relationship, that we must do what you don't do. If we want to be friends with you, we must do what you don't do. Because you think what you don't do, but what you want us to do, is good for us. What logic is that? But it requires leadership to be able to take on some of those things. And a lot of other things which have been trying to argue in this book, policy consistency and the like, which we don't also get on the African continent. Because donors are in search of solutions. They need to keep the ball rolling constantly. It's like a soccer star juggling the ball. It must not drop. So that's why we move from year to year, PRSP 1, PRSP 2, PRSP 3. He picked 1, he picked 2, he picked 3. And people are churning out ideas. Some of them completely crazy. International Service Delivery Authority, my friend Paul Collier, who goes around marketing all kinds of funny things, and says, you know, African governments have failed. They cannot meet the needs of their people. Right? What do we need as solution? We started in economics, development economics, with the idea of external agencies of restraint. In other words, powerful forces that will compel African governments to behave in a particular way. Since that doesn't seem to be working, Paul Collier says now we need, before there's somebody else suggested tough love. Tough love. We like you so much that we are prepared to kill you in public if you don't behave according to what we recommend. When that was seen to be problematic, Stephen Ellis wrote an article on tough love in a prominent journal that was widely quoted. And when that didn't seem to be working, Paul Collier came after his bottom billion, he wrote another book and said we need an international service delivery authority that will bring services directly to African people, bypassing their governments, because those governments are useless. So these are the kinds of things we as scholars need to step back. Tell me the development that has happened anywhere in human history that did not involve a public purpose. But public purpose economics, of course, was one of the victims of the neoliberal revolution that took place in the course of the 1970s into the 80s. And the kinds of things which the likes of Paul Galbraith, Kenneth Galbraith argued in the United States of economics with a public purpose, of the kinds of ideals that informed Keynesianism, of the kind of thinking that was at the heart of development studies at the beginning, became totally, unpopular, and you couldn't really effectively intervene. The African state, which is more criticized, was the victim of sustained ideological and policy attacks. I don't think any institution has been more attacked. Now, we Africans have problems. I mean, the contributions of Professor Peter Nyong'o to that discussion remain for me some of the most outstanding, together with Andika, Nzongola, and the others, when they challenged the idea that Africa's problem was not in fact one of getting prices right, but of getting the politics right, and reforming the African state to make it function in accordance with the ideals that informed the independence popular movement was part of the period. Accountability, rule of law, not to the people, but to Washington. Publish your account so that we can know what is happening. We don't need to be friends with your finance minister to extract the information. We want transparency, but not to the citizen. And these are the, I hope you understand my point of view in this regard. I think it's also important when we talk of the question which was raised about models of creating wealth and redistributing Singapore and all of that. My view is that we make a mistake if we assume that social policy is not a broader part of the strategy for production improvement. And studies which have been undertaken of the best welfare state systems the world has known in Scandinavia. If you go to the website of the Palme Foundation, you'll find studies that they produced. Sweden started as a poor country. It did not wait to create wealth first before redistributing. It undertook a project of redistribution as part of a production function in the economy. That if you took effective measures to promote social policy, I'm not talking of social protection, give a family a goat at Christmas and then they'll drink milk. Social policy of a universal kind, which will not stigmatize the recipients of social benefits because it is universal, in which we all go to the same hospital with the same quality, and you make the necessary investments, you will ultimately improve the productivity of your economy. You don't have to drive people into unemployment, retrench people from jobs, shut down clinics, close post offices, abandon maintenance of your infrastructure because you want to grow the economy first. That's what we've been doing. And where has it led us? That's what we've been doing. We are told to deflate the economy. As various African economists put it, I'm already sick with malaria. I come to you as my doctor. You tell me that the solution is to put more malaria parasites into me. So that I can, when I come out of it, I'll have this. That's the story of our continent. So we need to also understand, again, let's not compartmentalize things.
Professor Bayo for that illuminating presentation. I think those who are really into development studies have found a lot of factual material and also inspiration in understanding where we have come from. Maybe first I blow our trumpet, where you are talking about understanding our African societies. We have a course in the Institute for Development Studies on change and development of African societies. We have already disposed of stylization, and now the main issues of the day are what we are covering. Okay? So we are concerned about the reality. Now, coming to what I want to say, I got the sense that what has been said about development and development studies, that thinking and practice are closely matching together. You cannot be talking about development without thinking and practice. And development studies the same way. So I was quite intrigued by your assertion that development is an experimentation venture. And in an experiment, I think when you go in, you don't know what the outcome could be. And I want to refer to those who have set the agenda, those who have funded research. Could it be that there is a sense in which we can say, and this is also apologizing for them, that Father forgive them, they didn't know what they were doing. Because we know that studying rural development studies was a lot influenced by the World Bank Rural Development paper. We know that the World Bank made the mistake and thought that the market can do everything, rolled back the state. Then they came back and said, we were wrong. Let's understand what the state is about. And the PRSPs that you mentioned has brought into the discourse the point about stakeholders. And I think this is something that is finding a lot of relevance even at the community level. Who are the stakeholders? And what this means for me is we are having an opportunity as researchers in the first place to investigate about the community, okay? And then as development studies scholars, we are moving ahead in thinking more broadly about development, as you have mentioned. So I would have liked to see a little of the positive coming out without necessarily saying that all the wrongs that have been committed are now right. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much, Prof, for the lecture. I'm a Nigerian writer and a master's student at the Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies here. Yeah, I understand your narrative about different contexts, but I also believe that we might actually have to do comparisons to be able to do proper analysis on issues of development. In 1960, most African countries got their independence with a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, Middle East, and even Latin America. We used to have the same GDP with them. We used to have the same HDI, Human Development Index, with them. Now, decades after that, yeah, they've been able to lift millions out of poverty. They've been able to provide employment. They've been able to industrialize. And they've made tremendous progress development-wise. What major factors could you attribute to these major differences? Thank you so much.
Good question.
Thank you, Professor Nyong'o. Thank you very much for this powerful speech and lecture from Adebayo Olukoshi. I listened to him in Dar es Salaam and I'm sure at Mwalimu Nyerere Intellectual Festival on how universities in Africa were captured systematically by what he has said, donor and the IMF. But my question is, as 50 years of development studies has led us to this poverty and corruption and this hopelessness, where we have people dying in every village because of lack of healthcare, shelter and education. Now you have said if they want us to liberate us, they must do something called, you have said, counter revolution in a study. We still have universities like this one. It's like a supermarket. You come in and you buy which kind of degree you want. So that they can be able to finance their expenditure, and the professors and lecturers have been lupenized. They moved from one university to another so that they can earn their living. So how will they do this counter revolution?
Thank you very much. I'm Ben Ahmed, a student of this university and also a member of a youth club known as YALDA. Now my question to Professor Adebayo goes to agenda setting. In your remarks you say that the SAP, the MDGs, and now that you are moving to the SDGs have not been so productive to Africa's development. Whereas we as Africans, we have our own agendas
For example, we have the Agenda 2063, of which you didn't talk about, but you talked about the other global agendas. Don't you think that these continental agendas, like the Agenda 2063, have solutions to African problems? Because, like, if you have to do a comparative analysis, in Europe, it was 1945, they were able to adopt the Marshall Plan. And the economy was, Europe's economy was transformed. They were also able to adopt the Morgenthau Plan, and there was very limited interstate conflict. But here in Africa, we keep talking and countering the global agendas, whereas in such forums, instead of sitting down and deliberating on our continental agendas, we don't do that. So what is your reaction, or what is your view towards our own continental agenda, which is the Agenda 2063?
Which will prevent the world from sinking into another calamity. And from what Bayo was saying, what happened, one of the causes of the Second World War was inequality, deprivation. Hitler thought he could sort this out for the Germans by making the Aryan race superior, not just in Germany, but in Europe and the world, hence fascism. When that did not work, Europe woke up to the idea that if we neglect the issue of poverty, the reconstruction and development, another Hitler can easily come up, not just in Europe but elsewhere. Knowing that they themselves had been types of Hitlers in the colonial world, because colonies were really ruled by people who were not really better than Hitler. And one of the reasons why even the Americans were now pushing the British and the French to decolonize was precisely because we needed a safer world where development or social transformation could avoid another calamity. Now, what we are saying is that discourse on development, notwithstanding the very painful experience of Europe, when it came to the developing countries, the discourse on development was rather paternal. That the program for development was being developed elsewhere and being told, this is how you are going to develop. In many ways, it did not work, and it has not worked. The difference between Singapore and Malaysia and ourselves is 1964, Lee Kuan Yew realized that that model was not working. Another model had to be tried. What the Baker McCandless has called national developmentalism. In the case of Singapore, it more or less national authoritarian developmentalism. What some of us are advocating is a national democratic developmentalism, whose discourse and priority is a little different. And that is why in the NAC government, our manifesto was called Democracy and Popular Participation. That was the theme. Democracy and popular empowerment. And it's not a coincidence that the first thing that the Kibaki government did was to implement free primary school education, contrary to all kinds of naysayers who said it was not possible. But also a heavy investment in human resources development, which has been proven to work elsewhere, like in places like Sweden. Most countries which have developed since the Second World War have put tremendous investment in human development. The only area in which we failed was in health, and it's still a failure to this very day. But that's a discourse we should discuss further. Why is it that we were successful in investing in education? Public investment, enormous public investment, and we were not capable of doing the same in health, even to this very day. So, those choices and those ability to go beyond the prescriptions of developmentalists to having the prescriptions of what you might call national development initiatives, which are both democratic and popular, is perhaps the discourse we need to engage in the post-2015 era. Certain goals have been set, like from the MDGs to the SDGs, from my own perception, telling us that we should have better records of maternal or child health is not bad. Nobody wants mothers to die when they're giving birth. No. Nobody wants kids to die before 5. No. The question is, within what context of a developmental agenda is it going to be done? You could do like the Chinese did. Just decree, we are not going to have too many children. Every family, one child, we can look after them. China has now realized that that's not working very well. So they are encouraging people to have 2 children. So I think those kinds of critical choices, from what you call an internal point of view, is perhaps the discourse I believe that Bio is trying to put forward in the context of our times. Bio?
Thank you very much, Prof. Very much the message, which I hope has resonated, but if need be, should be repeated as much as possible. It is true that Africa and Asia started off at roughly the same levels of economic development, and if you pick up World Bank literature, free reference is made repeatedly to the fact that at independence, Ghana had a higher GDP per capita than Taiwan and South Korea and the like and the like and the like. But exactly as Professor Nyong'o said, what those countries succeeded in doing, and for which they had, importantly, the space to do it. They had the space to do it on account of Cold War geopolitics in Southeast Asia at the time, was precisely to be able to set national priority agendas for themselves and not be compelled to implement somebody else's agenda for themselves as the answer. And I think that is the key. If we don't win back policy space, we can pretend to try to call governments to account here, but in too many of our countries, let me give you the simplest example. Look at we did say it with Karuti Kahinga in the 90s when we were doing some research. And let us take the travel log, not of our ministers of foreign affairs, but our ministers of finance. Who do they go to? And you will be shocked that their journeys are usually in one direction, to Washington. Especially in the heyday of the structural adjustment program, where a finance minister basically became like the resident representative of the World Bank and the IMF within their own national government. And the World Bank and IMF determined who was enthroned or dethroned as finance minister and central bank governor in many of our countries. A study showed that 2/3 of the governors of our central banks are either serving staff or former staff of the World Bank and the IMF. So you can see the narrowing and closure of all room for maneuver and of policy space. It begins to define for you what is possible and what is not possible. If finance minister is lionized in the Western financial press, even though at home he or she has absolutely little or no credibility at all, well, it doesn't matter, because so long as you are doing the bidding of those who purport to drive a so-called Washington consensus, you are lionized as the person, the savior of Nigeria, cleaning up the accounts of Nigeria, even though they are stealing like crazy. But that's the narrative that you want to present to the international.
Let me begin by making this vote of thanks from a very small story. In the 1990s, I picked a friend of mine. We invited a friend of ours here to come to Kenya here, and those time, the 1990s had very few Nyamachoma places very few Nyamachoma places in this town. I think there was only Sagret and then Roasters on Vicar. And there was no traffic jam, of course, at that time. So I picked my friend and we decided to go to Sagret. And the only problem with Sagret, for those who can recall, is that they never used to have real goat meat. They used to have domba, but all the same, they used to call it Nyamachoma. So we arrived there, and this friend of mine said, the first thing I want is a cup of tea. So this waiter starts asking, are you a Luya? So this friend of mine asked him, why do you ask me whether I'm a Luya? Because you asked for tea. He said, no, I'm not a Luya, but give me tea. So we all went for our meat, and the tea was brought. And a different waiter now came to ask us for accompaniments, and this friend of mine said, give me mokimo. And this waiter asked him, are you a Kikuyu? You know? Now this was immediately after the elections of, I think, 1992 or something like that, later on 1994, 1995. The country was highly ethnicized because of the violence in the Rift Valley. Now, then this waiter followed me and asked me, this friend of yours is talking in a very funny accent, but he's a Kikuyu. And I asked him, why are you interested in Nyong'o? No, because he asked for tea. We know it's Luyas who take a lot of tea. And you see Kimo. Then anyway, the story does not end there. The next day, of course, we finished. I didn't tell the waiter who this person was and where he came from. But the next day, we were going to see Peter in Parliament. But we were allowed into Parliament, we went, and when we were outside the room there, Olentimama comes in a very big car and comes out of the vehicle in a very cynical manner. We have never told Peter this story. He comes out in a very cynical manner asking, what the hell is happening here? You know? I think those are the words. You know, in a very contemptuous manner of an institution of governance. You know? And he's asking fellow colleagues, and the fellow colleagues were now, he was a very powerful person, and all of them were moving on the side. Now, that person was Adebayo Olukoshi. Now, I've decided to tell that story because what he has given us here is actually that context matter. Context matter, and that's what we seem to be getting here, but we cannot actually generalize solutions to development. And it's from that time actually we started discussing the Washington Consensus. And our critique of the Washington Consensus was by way of collecting data in every African country and asking what the hell is happening here, using Chimama's words. And we realized that in some countries, actually the challenge to development was absence of politics of inclusion. In other countries, was the cynicism that accompanied political leaders with regard to how they looked at governance institutions, parliament and the judiciary. So no wonder he's very cynical about what the hell is going here. And it's the parliament to talk about, right? So institutions matter, politics of inclusion matter. In other places, we came to the realization that actually the state was the most difficult problem. That if we wanted to address the problem of Africa in the 1990s, our studies showed very well that we have got to go to the basics and start thinking about how to reform the African state. That's again the message that Bio is coming up with. At least that's where there is consensus in terms of what's the solution to Africa's development. The African state must be reformed. But also a debate that started well back in the 1980s from when Peter wrote Elite and Popular Struggle for Democracy. You know? So I think what the message we are getting here is that yes, we can have solutions to Africa, and it seems to be a very straightforward solution. And actually we are now, it's dawning on us that actually development doesn't seem to be very complex. It's we who are very complex and making it look very complex. But that's what we seem to be learning here, because with the right leadership and focused attitude to want change and a commitment to certain ideals of making a human society a better society for everyone to live in, then we resolve the problem. Then I think it's come up with a very good observation also that we have been making with some of my students, said that you are not a very good student. If you cannot remember Adebayo's name, you are not a good student. Right? And we shall call with you after this. Now, I think it's also touched on a very important issue here, policy consistency. In the last 50-something years of Kenya's history, I think the longest serving ministers for planning and development was Zachary Nyong'o and Nyong'o, if I'm not wrong. If I'm not wrong. In 50 years, and Nyong'o, we are talking about 5 years. Zachary Nyong'o, we are talking about 8 years or so. I doubt whether there is any other person who has ever served in that ministry for that long. Right? I may be corrected, but I'm simply saying when it comes to policy consistency, we get it absolutely wrong. And even permanent secretaries, they are no longer permanent. So even if someone came with a policy that needs to be pursued, permanent secretaries, actually the government has realized the right concept for them is principal secretaries. Not call them permanent because they will go the next day. So they're not permanent, but we have lived with the concept of permanent secretaries for a very long time, and yet they are not permanent. At least during Kenyatta's time, the longest, from what we did, some studies we did back, actually the longest serving PS, the shortest term for some PSs, I think on average was about 7 years. Some used to transit one election to another. Now, what this tells us, from what Adebayo is telling us, if we get those things right, policy consistency, leadership, transformation of the state, that which is very difficult, and then commitment to the ideal of transforming the society for the betterment of everyone, I think we get it right. But that's where we get virtually everything wrong. So with Adebayo, I think mine is simply to say thank you very much to you for at least helping us rekindle the debate that we have been having in this continent for a long while. Thank you very much for that. And to Peter, actually yesterday we began with bringing back Marxism in. William yesterday made a very good presentation on Marxism, actually using his paper, if you remember, law and development, commercial law and the law of contracts, the law of thought generally. He brought the debate back yesterday, and he said the problem at that time is that the superstructure had no connection with the economy. The superstructure was so neatly woven to the economy, but the superstructure was completely disconnected from the society, and that's the challenge we continue to live in today. That leadership is completely disconnected from those people that it governs, and that's a problem that Africa continues to witness. Thanks a lot for telling us to pay attention to that. But I think also something else that comes out in this regard is that we should not take everything that the African Union says seriously. We should not be taking African Union seriously, and don't put me outside this, but that's what seems to be coming. Because we had the NEPAD, we had the APRM, what else did we not have? We changed even the name from OAU to African Union, right? So we are very serious, so let's not take the African Union very seriously. We are very serious. Don't take them serious, because they will propose what they need the West to give them money for in order to transform the African societies. But if you want to know whether you can take them seriously or not, ask Mary Gadego at the back there. She monitors African Union standards on implementation of African standards. She works with Open Society Initiative for East Africa, where they have been tracking African standards and commitments. African standards and commitments to everything that they say. Monitoring everything from what the African governments have signed to, and ask you a few years later what has been done to this. And I wish Mary could say what the outcome is. Don't take African Union seriously on what it says. I'm not saying that that's with a light touch. Mine is simply to say thank you very much, everyone. I'm Bayo. Asante sana. This is, of course, not your first time here. This is not your last time here. We shall continue putting a lot of pressure on you. We shall always be telling you to please come and visit us at all times. Peter, you are one of us. Now I will be coming to your class often, now that you have come to compensate for that. You should ask me to get into his class sometimes, but thank you very much, everyone.